Why does everybody seem to have ADHD all of a sudden? It's one of those things that have become well known. If it's well known, people know what to look out for and may lead to higher diagnosis numbers. Another reason is self-diagnose. Being known can be good and bad. Many of us joke about having ADHD, bipolar, depression, anxiety, but there's a difference between an instance of one of those versus actually having the disorder. For example, you're anxious on your job interview. That's perfectly acceptable and normal. Having anxiety to come out of your house? Not so much. It's expected you'll be distracted at times. Perfectly normal, but when it's 24/7, not so much. Many of the people who claim to have it are just self-diagnosing as well. I once saw an interesting graph that showed the percent of the US population that was left-handed. Over time, from the 50s to the early 2000s, it should have been a mostly flat line, with maybe a little wobble due to statistical inaccuracies. It wasn't. It was an upward curve, followed by a plateau. A lot of people were confused. But I wasn't. My dad told me stories of when he was in elementary school in the 60s. His teachers forced him to sit on his left hand while writing, and smacked his left hand with a ruler when they caught him writing with it. Knowing that this kind of discrimination fell out of favor over the intervening decades, I wasn't surprised at all to see that graph. ADHD is considered very common, with 3 million cases per year in America alone. Mental disorders have lost some of their stigma, and the internet is especially known for people feeling more comfortable saying personal stuff. If someone has a disorder, it's not unlikely they'll feel fine with mentioning it. Diagnosis has also increased due to understanding of the disorder and general knowledge. The internet is a resource, although how good of one varies, of course. Way back when, you didn't know about disorders and their symptoms. Unless you had a personal interest. Now, you can find information easily. Many people, when experiencing something, will Google, "Why am I?" and find a bunch of possible reasons. Of course, sometimes it says you have cancer when you just have a cold. But if you're looking up ADHD symptoms you're experiencing, you'll likely find information on ADHD and realize they match. If you have money or insurance, you schedule an appointment to get tested and find out if you really do have it. Plus, algorithms are pretty good at what they do. Like memes about how forgetful you are. Might get some ADHD meme recommendations. And then you start to wonder if there's a reason you're forgetful. And then you probably do what I mentioned above. When they first started diagnosing ADHD in the 80s, they only studied it in boys and not girls, so they failed to diagnose half of the people who get it. They've also assumed it's something that goes away in adulthood, as they're realizing that ADHD symptoms look different in girls. More girls are getting diagnosed. They're also realizing it doesn't go away for everyone. And with postpubescent girls and women, hormone cycling can make symptoms worse. So for women, they start to get noticeable symptoms around puberty, and then they get worse as hormone levels drop. And then even worse as menopause hits. So there are a lot of women who weren't diagnosed as kids who are finally getting the correct diagnosis after doctors assumed they just had depression and anxiety that was resistant to medication. We also have the advent of virtual medicine, and COVID changes in the DIA made it possible to prescribe controlled substances after a virtual visit. There are people who think that means more people are getting misdiagnosed with ADHD, but when you have a population of people that sucks at calling to make a doctor's appointment, remembering the doctor's appointment, and showing up on time to the doctor's appointment, and then give them a different kind of appointment that's substantially easier to make and show up on time for, you're going to suddenly get people diagnosed who couldn't previously overcome their deficiencies in executive function to get to a doctor. It's also genetic. So parents, primarily moms of children learn about ADHD from their kid getting diagnosed and realize, I do that too. It's more recognized, diagnosed. It still existed before. We just ignored it. There's a very famous chart about left-handedness skyrocketing once the stigma went away. https www.washingtonpost.com/blogs/2015/09/lefthandedness1.png. Same thing. The estimates for ADHD put it at 49% of people. So 1 in 10, 20 or so. More if you're counting relationships like SOs. Also someone saying it sticks out to you. You notice the one person who posts saying they have ADHD. Your brain doesn't notice the 10-20 people who didn't post. Especially if you're focused on it. Then there's Baader-Meinhof as well. I think education on what it is and the public destigmatizing prescription meds are big parts of it. I was diagnosed in 2007 and it took my parents a long time to even accept that I should get checked. It's not very accepted in Latin culture. Funny example is watching Pedro Pascal's SNL skit imitating a Spanish mom. Looking back, it felt like no one cared if other people had ADHD. Beck, just try harder, and just buckle down and focus were their solutions. When I finally got on meds and was able to be a functioning student, my parents acted like I was cheating. It's not like I was a straight-A prodigy with meds. Just normal grades. Mostly B's with the occasional B+ or A. Anyway, I'm happy folks are finally getting the help they need, but we really gotta address this medicine shortage face with cold sweat. I was late diagnosed this year at 25. And in my experience the biggest thing I've learned is that through childhood, professionals, mental health assessors were putting my mannerisms down to childhood trauma. Rough childhood, bullying etc. While I have now learned that they haven't found what causes ADHD, and that it is linked to trauma. I've also learned how it presents differently in women. I think it's great people are talking about it more and bringing awareness to not so well known stereotype symptoms. Such as I thought it was just normal and I was just lazy for not being able to force myself to keep on top of my housework. Or being told by professionals that to reduce my stress all I had to do was just zone out and focus on a happy place. Meditation. And in fact, zoning out and meditating shouldn't be hard. And that all I had to do to stop having racing thoughts 24/7. Literally in my sleep too. Was to just not focus on those thoughts. I've had choruses of songs stuck in my head for literal days and nobody thought to tell me ADHD might be a possibility. Just an obsession with a song or whatever it may be. Of course, I can speak only on the behalf of women when I say we often get told it's hormonal or often misdiagnosed with something else such as BPD. My first experience with a psychiatrist ended with him advising me what birth control I should go to my GP and start taking, instead of any talking about my suspected ADHD. The reason for the appointment. So for me to see it acknowledged so much more brings light and validation to myself and also makes me feel good on behalf of others who I know are out there, feeling unheard and like they just aren't good enough at life. Sorry for the long post. But here is my experience in the recent boom of it being spoken about. I have been medicated for a month now and my entire life has become so much easier. I just got diagnosed with ADHD yesterday at 26 years old. I feel personally attacked. So the way that ADHD presents in women is different than in men. The differences have led to many women being misdiagnosed as having anxiety or depression or not diagnosed at all. Now that we are aware of the differences, women are being diagnosed more, but just later in life. I was diagnosed at 26 and my whole life no one ever suspected ADHD. Many women are being diagnosed in their 20s and 30s. When I was in school, they didn't diagnose ADHD. Like to anyone, you were just a fidgety or distractible kid. Now that diagnoses are a thing, obviously more people are going to have it. It was barely recognized 20 years ago. Now it's an actual thing that people can relate a lot of issues to. There is a lot of self-diagnosis thanks to YouTube and TikTok. Though ADHD was mostly studied in boys, so the criteria best describes symptoms a boy would show. It's the trope of the little boy on Ritalin because he can't sit still. ADHD presents differently in women and is less in your face because society socializes girls to be restrained, quiet, whatever. The symptoms are often expressed more inwardly. Now that doctors are seeing that yes, women have ADHD and have different symptoms. A lot of behaviors that were normalized in women, but actually ADHD symptoms, are being recognized as dysfunctional, which they are. If you meet a person with ADHD, ask them at what age they were diagnosed. Men will more often say 612. Women will more often say 3040 plus. The perception and understanding of it was skewed away from women. Just removing that barrier should be twice the diagnoses. Before AIDS was known, men just died because after it was discovered, suddenly everyone had AIDS? No. There was just a name for what already existed. The ADHD is already out there. Now we're just letting women benefit from the diagnosis. This is my take as someone diagnosed as a 29-year-old. In 2020, telehealth made therapy more accessible, both in terms of scheduling convenience as well as financially speaking. And while I believe this varies state to state, but there were also various online psychiatric practices for individuals to get assessed. It became a lot more available to seek out therapy and assessment. When ADHD was originally being researched, the majority of the diagnostic criteria for it was only based on observations of adolescent boys. The symptoms often manifest differently in girls. You didn't mention gender. And I know that guys can be diagnosed later in life too. I just bring it up because it's easier for it to go unnoticed by parents if they didn't know what to look for. I believe with more people being on social media during the pandemic and seeing more of people's anecdotal experiences about having it, may have driven more of a desire for people who related to get it looked into. I've had it for 23 years. And until recently, when I told people about it they would just shrug and assume that it meant I felt really hyper at inappropriate times. They would then proceed to still get mad at me when I had difficulty completing tasks. Essentially, talking about it made no difference except to make me anxious. Nowadays I feel like it's something worth telling people about because, for some reason, the general public learned what it really is during COVID. It's not really all of a sudden. It's been around for years and years. It's not well understood, but new ground is made every day. Not enough people were being diagnosed who had it in the past. Doctors have gotten better at finding it. Clinically diagnosed adult with ADHD here. Here's the long and short of it. From my perspective, /TLDR. ADHD is incredibly real, incredibly serious, and incredibly misunderstood, even by a large portion of the medical profession. Sadly, a confluence of factors including, but not limited to, general ignorance, stereotypes, ableism, and capitalism have all led to ADHD being misrepresented and trivialized in our culture. This despite reams of easily accessible scientific evidence that definitively proves the misinformation wrong. A bit more detail. The only real ADHD diagnoses are professionally administered ones. Self-diagnosis is terribly problematic. People who walk around telling themselves and others that they have ADHD, having never been evaluated by a qualified medical professional, are so out to lunch it's ridiculous. Most of these people are perfectly normally functioning humans, which further trivializes ADHD in the popular imagination. It's a self-feeding loop because many of these self-diagnosed folks probably first suspected they might have the disorder after encountering misleading or false information. They then unwittingly perpetuate those same falsehoods by diagnosing themselves and telling others they have it when they don't. Consequently, ADHD isn't taken seriously. This makes the lives of those of us clinically diagnosed with the condition that much harder. On top of the impairments we experience, we also have to fight our way through a world that, by and large, doesn't think we're for real. ADHD brains are structurally different from the average person's brain. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It is not a trend, a fad, an excuse, or a conspiracy theory. It is highly heritable, and most people diagnosed with ADHD also have at least one parent and/or sibling with the disorder, sometimes more. The neurophysiology of ADHD is defined, amongst other things, by a smaller and less active than average prefrontal cortex. Once people begin to understand that ADHD is not simply being absent-minded, lazy, or scatterbrained but an actual difference in brain structure and function, most of them shut their mouths and start listening to those of us actually living with it. If you're not struggling in any area of your life, you do not have ADHD. Believe me, you don't, and you don't want to have it. People who have never had any trouble academically, professionally, personally, or socially, but claim they have ADHD, do not have it. I'm not gatekeeping here. It's simply a fact. If a person isn't experiencing and being adversely affected by specific symptoms in at least 3 domains of their life as per the DSM-V criteria and those of all other standardized diagnostic tests for ADHD, they do not meet the clinical threshold and they are not suffering from ADHD. /PS. You might misplace your insert everyday item of your choice here once a week, or forget to reply to the odd email to your coworker. On a busy day, you might be 5 minutes late to an appointment once in a while, or bomb a presentation you had to give but weren't fully prepared for. These are normal human failings that we're all subject to. Now, consider this. With ADHD, these kinds of situations are the rule instead of the exception. Every day looks like that. Before you decide to diagnose yourself with ADHD, ask yourself, do I feel like I can barely cope with the most routine tasks of everyday life? Things like making and completing a to-do list, cleaning my room, or maintaining personal hygiene? Do I have trouble starting things? Do I have trouble finishing things? Do I have trouble maintaining focus and motivation pretty much all the time? Do I feel a perpetual lack of fulfillment and purpose in my life? If all of those questions seem way too deep and dark and philosophical for you, that should be your wake-up call that you don't have a clue what ADHD really is. If you're nodding your head as you read, then maybe you do indeed have ADHD, and you should get evaluated for a diagnosis. Edit. Formatting. It's not all of the sudden. What is happening is that the last 3 generations, Gen Zers, Millennials, and Zoomers, more so the last 2, are more aware of mental health issues and the struggles that come with it. So after 2 major recessions, 2 major wars, the war on terror, and a pandemic, a lot of us are all going to therapy and finding out we are ADHDers. It's a sign of the times. People with ADHD are more likely to use Reddit, TikTok for the dopamine boost. Because as it's more recognized and defined, it's easier to navigate in a clinical sense and diagnose. At the same time though, there are certainly people who misdiagnose themselves as they observe ADHD as a personality quirk. And because their personality happens to align with the symptoms of ADHD. Like, I literally went around as a teen saying I had Asperger's syndrome simply because I related to the show Daria. You've already gotten plenty of responses about self-diagnosed and the people who exaggerate for attention. But in my case, yes, I'm a recently diagnosed 34-year-old female. Having so much exposure to people of all types in recent years on social media made me realize that things I thought were just broken parts of me were actually lifelong symptoms of ADHD, and I've been able to recognize it in my parents who were never diagnosed or treated. People are talking about it because it's no longer taboo. It's not being ignored and explained away as kids will be kids. It's not swept under the rug and hidden anymore like it was when I was growing up in the 90s. It's not just about that kid that can't sit still, so give him Ritalin. For better or worse now, I have a diagnosis. I've been able to find new avenues for accommodating and accepting myself and others, and I've gained a lot more sympathy for humans in general. It's a scary, mean world out there, and we don't need to make it worse on each other. A part of it is that ADHD has had very little research in how it affects women and girls, and it was no research until recently. It presents differently for a lot of women and girls, and as a result has overlooked or misdiagnosed in a lot of cases. Because of more recent studies and better understanding of ADHD, more people are realizing they actually have ADHD, even if they didn't or don't look like the typical hyperboy that was understood to have ADHD.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.